My name is Stella. I'm 28 years old, and this is the story of how I discovered that some people will literally crawl out of the woodwork when they smell money, even if they haven't spoken to you in a decade. You won't believe the lengths my own parents went to when they found out I inherited $2.3 million, including showing up at my door with fake tears and a sob story that would make Hollywood jealous. Have you ever had someone treat you like garbage for years, then suddenly act like your best friend when you get something they want? If you've ever dealt with toxic family members who only care about what you can do for them, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what happened next will shock you and maybe help you recognize the warning signs in your own life. When Uncle Robert's lawyer called to tell me I'd inherited everything, I literally dropped my phone and had to sit on my kitchen floor because my legs gave out. $2.3 million. More money than I'd ever dreamed of having, from the one person in my family who actually gave a damn about me. I was working 2 dead-end jobs just to pay rent on my tiny apartment, eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, and suddenly I was rich beyond my wildest dreams. Uncle Robert had been battling cancer for months without telling anyone because he didn't want to be a burden, typical of the man who spent his whole life putting others first, while my parents spent their lives putting themselves first. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who never said "I love you," but showed up for every important moment in my life had left me everything, while the people who gave birth to me but never really raised me were about to find out they got exactly what they deserved: nothing. I should have been celebrating, but instead I felt this weird mix of grief and anticipation, like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And let me tell you, when that shoe dropped, it came down like a freaking anvil, because apparently my parents have some kind of supernatural ability to sniff out money from 3 states away. I had exactly 72 hours of peace before the vultures started circling, and the first call came from a number I hadn't seen in over 10 years but somehow still recognized immediately. My mother's voice was so sweet it could have given me diabetes, asking how I was doing and telling me she'd heard the news about Uncle Robert. The woman who couldn't be bothered to call me on my birthday for the past decade suddenly wanted to have a heart-to-heart about family and grief and how we all needed to stick together during this difficult time. Yeah, difficult time. That's one way to describe suddenly becoming a millionaire. But here's the thing that really gets me. She actually had the nerve to act surprised when I didn't immediately fall for her fake concern and manipulative small talk. Patricia Patterson, master manipulator and winner of the World's Most Selfish Mother Award, was about to put on the performance of her lifetime, and she had no idea that her daughter had finally grown a backbone. What she said next made my blood boil and confirmed every suspicion I'd been trying to talk myself out of for years. But it was just the beginning of the most twisted family drama you've ever heard. Before I tell you about the phone call that made me want to throw my phone against the wall, let me paint you a picture of what growing up as Stella Patterson was really like. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it like some inspirational movie. My childhood was like living in a house where everyone pretended to love each other, but nobody actually liked each other, where appearances mattered more than actual parenting, and where I learned early that I was basically an inconvenience with legs. Patricia and David Patterson were the kind of parents who looked good on paper but were absolutely toxic in real life. They fed me, clothed me, and made sure I went to school, but they never once made me feel like I mattered as a human being. Picture this. I'm 8 years old, excited about my school play where I'm playing a tree. Glamorous, I know. And I practically beg my parents to come watch me. Patricia spends 20 minutes explaining why she can't make it. She has a hair appointment, then book club, then she promised to help organize some church function. Basically, everything in the world was more important than watching her daughter wobble around in a brown costume. David just grunted from behind his newspaper and mumbled something about having to work late, which I later found out meant going to the casino with his buddies. I stood on that stage, scanning the audience for familiar faces that never showed up, and that's when I learned that disappointment tastes like cardboard and feels like a rock in your stomach. The worst part wasn't the big moments they missed. It was the daily emotional neglect that slowly crushed my spirit over the years. Patricia was always too busy with her drama, whether it was fighting with the neighbors, gossiping about church members, or having meltdowns about money, to notice that her daughter was basically raising herself. David was physically present but emotionally absent, like a piece of furniture that occasionally asked me to bring him a beer or turn up the TV volume. They never asked about my friends, my dreams, my fears, or what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was just this extra person living in their house who sometimes needed rides to school. By the time I was a teenager, I had perfected the art of being invisible because it was safer than being noticed. When Patricia and David fought, which was constantly, I learned to disappear into my room and pretend I couldn't hear them screaming about money, about David's gambling, about Patricia's shopping addiction, about whose fault it was that their marriage was falling apart. Nobody ever once considered how their toxic relationship was affecting their daughter, or maybe they just didn't care enough to think about it. I became an expert at making my own meals, doing my own laundry, and solving my own problems, because asking for help was just another way to inconvenience people who had already made it clear I wasn't a priority. The saddest part is that I spent years thinking this was normal, thinking all families were like this, thinking that love was supposed to be conditional and hard to earn. I didn't realize how screwed up my childhood was until I started spending time at friends' houses and seeing parents who actually seemed to enjoy their kids' company, who asked questions about their day and remembered the answers, who showed up to school events and acted proud instead of bored. That's when I started to understand that Patricia and David hadn't just failed as parents. They had actively damaged me in ways that would take years to undo. But the universe had a funny way of balancing things out, because while my parents were busy being selfish and neglectful, Uncle Robert was quietly watching everything and planning something that would change my life forever. If you think what I've told you so far about my parents sounds bad, buckle up because I haven't even gotten to the really messed up stuff yet. Don't forget to hit that like button if you can relate to having parents who were more like toxic roommates than actual family. Let me tell you about my 16th birthday, the day that perfectly summarized what it was like to be Patricia and David's daughter, and the moment I realized I was completely on my own in this world. I had been looking forward to this birthday for months because I thought maybe, just maybe, they would make an effort to make me feel special for once in my miserable teenage life. Instead, I got a masterclass in disappointment and a front row seat to the Patterson family dysfunction Olympics. Have you ever had a moment where you realized your parents cared more about their own drama than they did about you? My birthday fell on a Saturday, and I woke up that morning actually excited because Patricia had mentioned doing something special for my sweet 16. What she meant by special, apparently, was using my birthday as an excuse to throw a party for her church friends, while completely ignoring the fact that it was supposed to be my day. She invited 20 of her gossipy church ladies over for what she called a celebration, but spent the entire time complaining about how expensive everything was and how much work it was to do nice things for me. The cake was from the grocery store clearance section. The decorations were leftover Christmas stuff spray-painted pink, and the whole thing felt like I was a prop in Patricia's performance as Mother of the Year. But here's where it gets really good. David decided that my birthday party was the perfect time to disappear to the casino, leaving me alone with Patricia and her judgmental church cronies who spent 2 hours talking about everyone who wasn't there, instead of acknowledging that it was my birthday. When Mrs. Wilson asked where my friends were, Patricia actually said, "Oh, Stella's always been a loner. She prefers adult company," which was her way of saying I didn't have friends without admitting that she had never bothered to help me maintain friendships or invite people over. I sat there eating clearance birthday cake while a bunch of middle-aged women gossiped about the pastor's wife's new haircut, feeling like a complete outsider at my own birthday party. The final insult came when David rolled in around midnight, clearly having lost whatever money he'd taken to the casino, and had the audacity to ask me if I'd had a nice day, while reeking of cigarettes and cheap whiskey. When I didn't respond with enough enthusiasm, he got that look on his face, the one that meant I was about to get a lecture about being ungrateful and spoiled, and went off on this rant about how some kids don't even get birthday parties, and how I should be thankful for what I had. Patricia chimed in with her favorite guilt trip about how much they sacrificed to give me a nice life, conveniently forgetting that throwing a half-hearted party with clearance cake hardly qualified as a sacrifice. That night, lying in bed listening to them fight about the money David had lost and the money Patricia had spent on my expensive birthday party, I made a promise to myself that I would never ever depend on these people for my happiness or my sense of self-worth again. I was 16 years old, and I already knew that growing up without knowing what a real home felt like was going to mess me up in ways I couldn't even imagine yet. But at least I had the clarity to see that my parents were the problem, not me. What I didn't know was that across town, Uncle Robert was watching all of this dysfunction play out and making plans to give me something my parents never could, a real chance at a better life. But first, I'd have to survive 2 more years of their toxicity and learn to find my worth in something bigger than their approval. Now let me tell you about the one person who saved my sanity during those hellish teenage years. And if you've ever had someone show up for you when your own family couldn't be bothered, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this part of the story will restore your faith in humanity. Uncle Robert was everything my father wasn't: reliable, present, and actually interested in who I was as a person rather than seeing me as just another burden to manage. The day after my disaster birthday party, when I was still feeling sorry for myself and questioning whether I was really as worthless as my parents made me feel, Uncle Robert showed up at our door with a small wrapped box and asked if I wanted to go get some real birthday cake. Have you ever had someone rescue you from your own family without even trying? That afternoon changed everything for me because it was the first time an adult had ever made me feel like I was worth their time and attention. We drove to this little diner across town where Uncle Robert ordered 2 slices of chocolate cake, and just let me vent about how awful my birthday had been without trying to defend Patricia and David or make excuses for their behavior. He didn't give me some bullshit lecture about being grateful or respecting my elders. He just listened and occasionally nodded or made a comment that showed he actually understood how screwed up the situation was. When I finished ranting, he slid the small box across the table and said, "Real family remembers what matters to you." Inside that box was a simple silver necklace with a small compass pendant. And when I asked him why he'd chosen a compass, his answer became one of the most important lessons of my life. "Stella," he said, "when you're surrounded by people who try to make you lose your way, you need something that always points you toward true north. Don't let anyone else's chaos make you forget which direction you're supposed to be heading." That necklace became my most treasured possession, not because it was expensive, it probably cost $30, but because it represented the first time someone had given me a gift that showed they actually knew me and cared about my future. From that day forward, Uncle Robert became my refuge from the insanity at home, and he did it without ever bad-mouthing Patricia and David or making me feel like I had to choose sides. Every couple of weeks, he'd find some excuse to stop by and ask if I wanted to help him with a project or run errands, and those afternoons became the highlight of my existence. He taught me how to use tools, how to change a tire, how to balance a checkbook, all the practical life skills that my parents were too self-absorbed to bother teaching me. But more importantly, he taught me that I had value, that my thoughts and opinions mattered, and that there were adults in the world who could be trusted to keep their word. The contrast between Uncle Robert's steady presence and my parents' chaotic dysfunction became more obvious as I got older and started to understand what healthy relationships actually looked like. When I got accepted to college and Patricia complained about the cost while David grumbled about me getting above my station, Uncle Robert quietly helped me fill out financial aid forms and drove me to campus visits without making a big production about it. When I had my first heartbreak at 17 and came home crying, my parents barely looked up from their TV show. But Uncle Robert spent 3 hours on his porch listening to me pour my heart out and offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from someone who's lived through real pain. Love is demonstrated through actions, not words. And Uncle Robert proved every single day that real family shows up when it matters, listens without judgment, and invests in your future even when it's inconvenient. Little did I know that he was doing something much bigger than just being a good uncle. He was preparing me for a responsibility that would test everything he had taught me about character, integrity, and what it means to honor the people who truly love you. If you've ever gotten news so shocking that your brain literally couldn't process what you were hearing, then you'll understand what happened to me on that Tuesday morning in March that changed my entire world. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what I'm about to tell you about Uncle Robert's final gift will blow your mind. I was running late for my shift at the department store where I'd been folding clothes and dealing with entitled customers for 3 years, when my phone rang with an unknown number that I almost ignored. Thank God I didn't, because Mr. Harrison, Uncle Robert's lawyer, was calling to tell me something that made me literally sit down on my kitchen floor because my legs stopped working. Have you ever received news that was so life-changing you actually felt your reality shift in real time? Miss Patterson, you are the sole beneficiary of Robert Patterson's estate, which includes his home, his construction business, and liquid assets totaling approximately $2.3 million. I swear the words echoed in my head like I was in some kind of movie, and for about 30 seconds I couldn't breathe because I thought I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Uncle Robert had died 5 days earlier, something I only found out through a 2-sentence text from David that said, "Robert's dead, funeral Thursday." And now I was being told that this man had left me everything he'd worked his entire life to build. The lawyer kept talking about paperwork and tax implications, and when I could come in to sign documents, but all I could think about was how Uncle Robert had been secretly battling cancer for months, without telling anyone, because he didn't want to be a burden on anybody. The first emotion wasn't joy or excitement. It was this crushing sense of responsibility mixed with grief that felt like someone had dropped a piano on my chest. Uncle Robert had chosen me over everyone else in his family, including his own brother, who was my father. And that choice meant something bigger than just money. This inheritance wasn't just about being lucky or being in the right place at the right time. It was about Uncle Robert looking at everyone in his life and deciding that I was the only one who could be trusted with his legacy. The weight of that trust felt heavier than the actual money, especially when I started thinking about how Patricia and David were going to react when they found out they'd been completely cut out of the will. But here's what really messed with my head. Instead of feeling like my problems were solved, I felt like they were just beginning, because suddenly I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of, and absolutely no idea how to handle it responsibly. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years, worrying about rent and groceries, and whether my car would make it through another month, and now I was supposed to figure out what to do with millions of dollars without screwing it up. I started having these panic attacks where I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced that this was all some kind of mistake, that they'd mixed up the paperwork and someone was going to show up demanding their money back. The really twisted part was that I found myself grieving Uncle Robert's death while simultaneously dreading the moment my parents found out about the inheritance, because I knew exactly what kind of circus was coming my way. Uncle Robert had protected me from their toxicity while he was alive, and now he was still protecting me from beyond the grave by giving me the financial security to never have to depend on them for anything ever again. But money has this weird way of bringing out the absolute worst in people, especially people who already have no shame or boundaries when it comes to getting what they want. I should have been celebrating the fact that I'd never have to worry about bills or rent again, but instead, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the people who gave birth to me were about to show me exactly what they were really made of. And let me tell you, what happened next proved that some people will literally sell their souls if they think there's money involved. The call that proved my parents had some kind of supernatural ability to smell money came exactly 72 hours after the inheritance became official, and I need you to understand that this timing was no coincidence. I want you to hit that like button if you've ever had someone contact you out of the blue when they suddenly needed something from you. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, still trying to process the fact that I was now technically a millionaire, when my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in over a decade. Patricia's voice was so sickeningly sweet it made my teeth hurt, and she launched into this performance that deserved an Academy Award for Most Manipulative Mother in a Supporting Role. She started with the fake concern. "Stella, honey, I heard about Uncle Robert and I just wanted to check on you during this difficult time, like we had talked just yesterday instead of having 10 years of total silence between us. But here's where it gets really rich. Patricia actually had the nerve to act like a grieving family member who was just trying to reconnect during our shared time of loss. She went on and on about how much she'd always cared about Robert, how sad she was that he'd suffered with cancer alone, and how important it was for family to stick together when tragedy strikes. This is the same woman who called Uncle Robert weird and antisocial for years because he wouldn't loan David money for his gambling debts. But suddenly she was acting like they'd been best friends. She kept emphasizing how family is all we have, and how money can't replace the people we love, which was hilarious coming from someone who had prioritized money over her own daughter for my entire childhood. David got on the phone too, and hearing his voice after all those years brought back every awful memory I'd tried to suppress about growing up in that toxic household. He put on this fake emotional voice and started talking about how proud he was of the woman I'd become, and how he'd always known I was special. This from the man who couldn't be bothered to attend my high school graduation because it conflicted with a poker game. He rambled on about family bonds and blood being thicker than water, and how Uncle Robert would have wanted us to be close, conveniently forgetting that Uncle Robert had seen exactly what kind of parents they were, and had chosen to invest in me instead of them. Then came the part that made my stomach turn. Patricia started fishing for information about the will with all the subtlety of a bulldozer. She didn't come right out and ask how much I'd inherited, but she danced around it with questions like, "I hope Robert took care of you in his final wishes," and "It's so wonderful when family looks out for each other," and my personal favorite, "I'm sure he left you something special to remember him by." When I didn't immediately volunteer details about my inheritance, she started getting more direct, mentioning how they'd been going through some financial difficulties and how they'd been praying for a miracle to help them get back on their feet. By the end of that phone call, Patricia had planted every seed she needed to plant for what was coming next. The guilt trips about family obligations, the hints about their financial desperation, and the suggestion that maybe this inheritance was God's way of bringing our family back together. She even had the audacity to suggest that I come visit them so we could properly grieve Uncle Robert together and start healing our family, which was obviously code for, "Come over so we can work on you in person and figure out exactly how much money we're dealing with." What I didn't realize was that this phone call was just the opening act, because when Patricia and David showed up at my apartment 2 weeks later with their luggage and their sob story, I was about to get a masterclass in emotional manipulation that would make a cult leader jealous. If you've ever been in a situation where your heart and your brain were having an all-out war inside your chest, then you know exactly what I was going through in the weeks after that manipulative phone call from my parents. Please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if you've ever been torn between wanting to believe people could change and knowing deep down that they probably haven't. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction from Patricia and David, reminding me of every birthday they missed, every time they chose their own drama over my needs, every way they had failed me as parents. But there was this wounded little girl inside me who was still desperately hoping that maybe, just maybe, losing Uncle Robert had made them realize what really mattered, and they genuinely wanted to make things right. Have you ever wanted something so badly that you were willing to ignore every red flag just to have a chance at getting it? The internal battle was absolutely exhausting, because I'd spend hours remembering all the ways they'd hurt me, then immediately start making excuses for them and imagining scenarios where we could actually have the loving family relationship I'd always dreamed of. I'd remember my 16th birthday disaster and feel angry all over again, then catch myself thinking, but maybe they've grown up since then, or maybe they didn't realize how much they were hurting me. It's like my brain was playing this sick game where every valid reason to protect myself got countered by some pathetic hope that blood relations could magically transform into real love if I just gave them one more chance. The worst part was dealing with the guilt that came with having something my parents desperately needed, while simultaneously not trusting their motives for suddenly wanting a relationship. I knew they were drowning in debt from David's gambling and Patricia's shopping addiction. That much was obvious from the hints they'd dropped during our phone call. And part of me felt horrible for having millions of dollars while they were struggling to pay basic bills. The Christian part of me kept whispering things like, "What would Jesus do?" and "Forgiveness means giving people second chances." But the practical part of me was like, Jesus also said to be wise as serpents, and these people are definitely serpents. I started having these imaginary conversations where I'd practice different ways to handle their inevitable visit, rehearsing scenarios where they proved they'd genuinely changed, and others where they showed their true colors once again. I'd lie awake at night remembering the little girl who used to hide in her room during their fights, wondering if that little girl deserved one more shot at having real parents, even if it meant risking getting hurt all over again. The emotional whiplash was insane. One minute I'd be furious about their abandonment and manipulation. The next minute I'd be planning how I could help them get back on their feet financially if they showed genuine remorse for their past behavior. But here's what really messed with my head. I started questioning whether I was being too harsh or unforgiving, whether holding on to resentment about the past was preventing me from embracing the possibility of a better future with them. I kept thinking about Uncle Robert and what he would want me to do, but the problem was that he'd never actually told me what he thought about my parents, or why he'd chosen to leave everything to me instead of them. When the pain comes from people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, the healing process gets complicated because you're not just dealing with the hurt. You're dealing with the hope that somehow, some way, they might actually be capable of loving you the way you've always needed them to. Little did I know that this internal war between hope and wisdom was preparing me for the performance of a lifetime when Patricia and David showed up at my door with their luggage, their tears, and their carefully rehearsed plan to guilt me into giving them what they wanted. The concept of forgiveness became my obsession during those sleepless weeks, but not in some peaceful, spiritual way. I was wrestling with it like Jacob wrestling with the angel, except I kept getting my ass kicked. I spent hours researching what forgiveness actually meant, reading everything from psychology articles to religious texts, trying to figure out if I was supposed to forgive and forget or forgive and protect myself. And let me tell you, nobody prepares you for how confusing this stuff gets when it's your own parents who screwed you over. The more I studied, the more I realized that most people who preach about forgiveness have never actually had to forgive someone who systematically damaged them for years and then showed up demanding more access to hurt them again. Here's what nobody tells you about forgiveness when it comes to toxic family members. It's not some magical moment where you suddenly feel all warm and fuzzy about people who treated you like garbage. It's more like deciding to stop carrying a backpack full of rocks that's been crushing your spine for years. But that doesn't mean you're obligated to invite the people who put those rocks there to come over and load up some new ones. I started to understand that forgiveness was about freeing myself from the poison of resentment, not about giving Patricia and David a free pass to continue their toxic behavior or unlimited chances to prove they could do better. The breakthrough came when I realized that forgiveness doesn't automatically restore trust or relationship, and it sure as hell doesn't mean pretending that people have changed when their actions prove they haven't. I could release the anger I'd been carrying toward my parents without giving them access to my heart, my home, or my inheritance. I could choose not to wish harm on them without pretending that they were suddenly trustworthy people who had my best interests at heart. Forgiveness meant letting go of my need for revenge or justice, but it didn't mean becoming stupid or naive about their patterns of behavior. But here's where it gets really complicated. I started to understand that real forgiveness actually requires boundaries, not the elimination of them. The most loving thing I could do for Patricia and David might be to refuse to enable their manipulative behavior by making it clear that their tactics wouldn't work on me anymore. Maybe the kindest thing I could do was to stop participating in the dysfunctional dance we'd been doing for years, where they created chaos and I tried to manage it, where they made demands and I felt guilty for not meeting them. The hardest lesson was learning that protecting myself from manipulation wasn't unforgiveness. It was wisdom. Forgiveness is like liberating a prisoner and then realizing that the prisoner was actually yourself, but that doesn't mean you have to unlock all your doors and invite the people who imprisoned you to come make themselves comfortable in your living room. I could pray for Patricia and David's healing and transformation without trusting them with my peace, my future, or my inheritance until they demonstrated genuine change through consistent actions over time, not just pretty words and temporary tears. What I didn't realize was that this new understanding of forgiveness was about to be put to the ultimate test when my parents showed up at my apartment with a performance so manipulative and desperate that it would make a soap opera look like a documentary. The performance that would win Patricia and David the Oscar for most shameless parents ever happened on a cold Thursday evening. And I need you to buckle up because what I'm about to tell you is so outrageous, you might think I'm making it up. If you've ever experienced emotional manipulation from family members who think they deserve your money just because they contributed DNA to your existence, please hit that subscribe button and like this video because this story is about to get wild. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, because boundaries are apparently just suggestions to these people, carrying 2 suitcases, a bouquet of wilted gas station flowers, and wearing the kind of fake, humble expressions that should come with a warning label. Patricia immediately threw her arms around me like we were reuniting after a war instead of a decade of mutual avoidance. And I swear her cheap perfume mixed with desperation created a smell that could knock a buzzard off a garbage truck. The first red flag should have been the suitcases, but I was still operating under the delusion that maybe they'd just come for a visit to reconnect, like they'd mentioned on the phone. Wrong. These people had come to move in and weren't taking no for an answer without a fight. David started unloading their stuff like he owned the place, talking about how family should stick together during difficult times, and how they'd already given notice at their apartment because they were so excited to spend time with their daughter. When I asked how long they were planning to stay, Patricia got this wounded look on her face and said, "Oh, honey, we were hoping we could stay here for a while until we get back on our feet. You know how hard things have been for us lately." Then came the sob story to end all sob stories. And let me tell you, these people had clearly been practicing this performance for weeks. Patricia pulled out medical bills and eviction notices and bank statements showing negative balances, spreading them across my coffee table like she was presenting evidence in court. She started crying, actual tears, which impressed me because I'd never seen her cry about anything except soap opera episodes. Talking about how David's heart condition was getting worse and how they couldn't afford his medication David chimed in with his own dramatic monologue about losing his job due to ageism and how they'd been eating 1 meal a day to save money, conveniently leaving out the parts about his gambling addiction and her shopping compulsions. But here's where it gets really good. They actually had the nerve to suggest that my inheritance was divine intervention meant to save their lives and reunite our family. Patricia kept saying things like God works in mysterious ways, and Robert always said family should take care of each other. And this must be why he left you all that money, so you could help us when we needed it most. They painted themselves as victims of circumstance who had learned from their past mistakes and were ready to be the loving parents I'd always deserved. If only I would give them a chance, and maybe some financial support to get them back on their feet. The manipulation reached peak levels when they started using Uncle Robert's memory as emotional blackmail, claiming that he would be so happy to see our family reunited, and that helping them was what he would have wanted me to do with his legacy. Patricia actually said, "Robert knew how much we love you, sweetheart. That's why he made sure you'd have the resources to take care of your family when we needed you." David nodded along and added, "Your uncle always believed that money should bring people together, not drive them apart," which was hilarious considering Uncle Robert had specifically chosen not to leave them anything in his will. But the real kicker came when they presented their proposal. If I let them stay with me and help them get back on their feet financially, they would be the parents I'd always wanted, and we could finally be the happy family we were meant to be. Some people only remember you exist when something valuable is at stake. And that night I learned that my parents were willing to put on the performance of their lives if they thought there was money involved. But what they asked me to do next crossed a line that even I didn't think they had the audacity to cross. In the days after my parents' Academy Award-worthy manipulation fest, I found myself turning to prayer not for comfort, but for the strength not to do something I'd regret, like throwing their suitcases out my second-story window. I need you to hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to rely on your faith to keep you from making decisions based on pure rage instead of wisdom. The weight of their presence in my tiny apartment was suffocating, and every morning I'd wake up hoping this was all some kind of nightmare, only to hear Patricia in my kitchen making coffee like she owned the place, and David watching my TV with the volume cranked up like he was deaf. Have you ever had unwanted house guests who acted like they were doing you a favor by invading your space and demanding you take care of them? Here's what really messed with my head. They had turned my inheritance into some kind of religious test, where I was supposed to prove my faith and my love for family by bankrolling their irresponsible lifestyle. Patricia kept quoting Bible verses about honoring your parents and taking care of family, conveniently ignoring all the verses about parents not provoking their children to anger or about reaping what you sow. Every time I tried to set boundaries or suggest they needed to make their own plans, she'd get this martyred expression and start talking about how disappointed Uncle Robert would be to see me being selfish with the blessings God had given me through his hard work and sacrifice. The verse that kept haunting me was, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And I started to realize that this whole situation was revealing everyone's true heart, including my own. Uncle Robert's treasure had been invested in my character and my future, but Patricia and David's hearts were clearly focused on the money itself, not on genuine relationship or making amends for their past failures. They weren't trying to rebuild our relationship. They were trying to access my bank account, and they were using God and family obligation as their manipulation tools. I spent hours on my knees in my bedroom, the only space they hadn't invaded, asking God for wisdom about how to handle this situation without compromising my integrity or enabling their destructive behavior. I kept thinking about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness, how the devil had tried to use his physical needs and desires to manipulate him into making decisions that would have destroyed his mission. I saw the parallel in my own situation. Patricia and David were using my emotional needs and my desire for family connection to try to manipulate me into making financial decisions that could destroy Uncle Robert's legacy and my own future. The breakthrough came when I started praying not just about what I should do, but about who God wanted me to become through this trial. I realized that this inheritance wasn't just about money, it was about stewardship, about being faithful with what had been entrusted to me, about learning the difference between being generous and being foolish. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I finally understood that my heart needed to be focused on honoring God and Uncle Robert's trust in me, not on trying to purchase love from people who had already proven they didn't know how to give it freely. But this spiritual clarity was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible when Patricia and David dropped their mask completely and showed me exactly what they were willing to do to get their hands on my money. The moment that would define the rest of my life came on a Sunday morning when I was trying to have my quiet time with God, while Patricia was banging around in my kitchen like she was conducting a one-woman percussion concert. If you've ever had to choose between keeping toxic people happy and protecting your own sanity, make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up because what happened next still gives me chills. I had been praying for wisdom about how to handle their increasingly aggressive demands for money when my phone rang with a call that made my blood turn to ice water. It was Patricia's voice, but gone was any pretense of sweetness or fake maternal concern. This was the real Patricia, the one I remembered from my childhood when she was about to deliver an ultimatum that wasn't really an ultimatum because there was only one acceptable answer. "Stella, we need to have a serious conversation about your responsibilities as our daughter," she said. And I could hear David coaching her in the background, like they were running some kind of con game. What she told me next proved that everything I'd suspected about their motives was not only true, but actually worse than I'd imagined. They had spent the past 2 weeks researching Uncle Robert's will and had found a lawyer willing to challenge it on the grounds that he wasn't mentally competent when he wrote it, claiming his cancer medication had impaired his judgment. They had medical records, witness statements from people who would say anything for money, and a legal strategy designed to drag the inheritance through probate court for years while draining it with legal fees. But here's the truly sick part. They presented this legal threat as if they were doing me a favor by giving me a chance to do the right thing before they destroyed both of us in court. Patricia laid out what she called their generous offer. If I voluntarily gave them $800,000, over a third of my inheritance, they would drop their legal challenge and we could move forward as a loving family. She actually used those words, loving family, while simultaneously threatening to financially ruin me if I didn't pay their ransom. David got on the phone to add his own threats, telling me that fighting them would cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees and take years to resolve, potentially freezing all the assets so I couldn't access them anyway. The manipulation reached its peak when they started using my faith against me, claiming that a good Christian daughter would want to help her parents in their time of need, and that refusing to share my inheritance was basically spitting in God's face. Patricia actually said, "What would Jesus think about you hoarding all this money while your own parents suffer?" Which was rich coming from someone who had spent my entire childhood prioritizing her own wants over her daughter's basic emotional needs. They painted a picture of a long, expensive legal battle that would tear our family apart forever, unless I did the loving thing and gave them what they deserved as my parents. In that moment, listening to these people threaten to destroy Uncle Robert's legacy and my future, Unless I paid them off like some kind of mafia protection racket, I felt something click into place inside me that I'd never felt before. Absolute clarity about who they really were and what I needed to do about it. It wasn't what happens to us, but what we do with what happens to us that defines who we are. And I knew that how I handled this moment would determine whether I'd spend the rest of my life being their victim or finally breaking free from their toxic control. I took a deep breath, thought about Uncle Robert and everything he taught me about standing up for what's right, and made the decision that would change everything. I told them exactly where they could shove their threats and their fake family reunion. And let me tell you, their reaction proved that I'd been right about them all along. After I told Patricia and David that they could take their legal threats and their emotional manipulation and go straight to hell, yes, I actually used those words, the silence on the other end of the phone was so complete I thought they'd hung up on me. What followed was a 15-minute explosion of rage, threats, and name-calling that reminded me exactly why I needed to distance myself from these people in the first place. And honestly, it was like getting a front-row seat to watch their masks completely fall off. They called me ungrateful, selfish, heartless, and a bunch of other names that would make a sailor blush, proving that all their talk about love and family and second chances had been complete garbage designed to manipulate me into opening my wallet. But here's the thing that hit me as I sat there listening to them reveal their true colors. This meltdown was actually a gift because it showed me exactly what Uncle Robert had been protecting me from all these years. He hadn't just left me money, he had left me the tools and the wisdom to recognize manipulation when I saw it, to value myself enough to set boundaries, and to understand that real love doesn't come with threats and conditions attached. Every Saturday morning he'd spent teaching me about integrity. Every Sunday dinner where he'd listened to my problems without trying to fix them for me. Every quiet lesson about standing up for what's right. All of that had been preparing me for this exact moment. The emotional and spiritual inheritance I'd received was worth more than the $2.3 million, though I'll admit the money didn't hurt either. Uncle Robert had taught me that my worth wasn't determined by other people's approval, that love should be demonstrated through consistent actions rather than empty promises, and that protecting your peace isn't selfish. It's necessary for your mental and spiritual health. He had shown me what it looked like to be generous without being foolish, kind without being a pushover, and faithful without being naive about people's motives. These lessons had been deposited into my heart one conversation at a time, and now I understood that this was the real treasure he'd been building in me. I thought about all the times Uncle Robert could have turned me against Patricia and David by telling me the truth about their character, but he'd never done that because he understood that I needed to come to my own conclusions about who they really were. Instead, he had quietly built something stronger in me, a foundation of self-worth and spiritual strength that could withstand their manipulation and threats because it was rooted in truth rather than in emotional wounds or desperate hope for their approval. The protection that God had given me through Uncle Robert's influence was now shielding me from the very people who should have been protecting me themselves. Standing in my living room after I hung up on their tantrum, I felt a peace that I had never experienced before, the peace that comes from finally understanding your identity and your purpose. I wasn't just Stella Patterson, the girl whose parents had failed her. I was Stella Patterson, the woman who had been chosen and prepared by God to be a faithful steward of Uncle Robert's legacy. The true inheritance wasn't about what I had received. It was about who I had become worthy of receiving it. And no amount of legal threats or emotional manipulation could take that away from me. But this clarity about my real inheritance was about to be tested one more time when Patricia and David made one final desperate attempt to get their hands on my money that would backfire so spectacularly, it was almost worth the years of therapy I'd need to recover from their toxic parenting. The weeks following my epic phone confrontation with Patricia and David taught me more about what real family actually looks like than 28 years of dysfunctional DNA connections ever could. And I need you to hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to learn the hard way that blood doesn't automatically make people worthy of your love and trust. If you've ever realized that the people you call family based on genetics are actually more toxic than strangers, give this video a like because what I discovered changed everything about how I define relationships and belonging. 3 days after I told my parents where they could stick their threats, I was sitting in my church feeling lost and emotionally drained when Mrs. Henderson, this sweet elderly woman who had barely spoken to me before, slid into the pew next to me and whispered, "Honey, you look like you could use some of my famous apple pie and a good listening ear. Have you ever had a complete stranger show you more motherly love in 5 minutes than your actual mother showed you in decades?" That afternoon in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, eating homemade pie and telling her about the nightmare my parents had put me through, I experienced something I'd never felt before. Unconditional support from someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from being kind to me. She didn't ask how much money I'd inherited, didn't hint about her own financial struggles, didn't make me feel guilty for having something she didn't have. Instead, she listened without judgment, offered wisdom without strings attached, and celebrated Uncle Robert's trust in me without any ulterior motives. When I finished my story, she patted my hand and said, "Sugar, real family celebrates your victories without trying to profit from them, and they support you through challenges without expecting to be paid back for their love." The contrast between Mrs. Henderson's genuine care and my parents' manipulative demands hit me like a lightning bolt. Here was a woman who barely knew me offering more maternal support in one afternoon than Patricia had given me in my entire life, and she was doing it simply because she recognized that I needed someone to care about me as a person, not as a potential ATM machine. Pastor Williams and his wife had been the same way, checking on me regularly since Uncle Robert's death, bringing me meals during the stressful weeks with my parents, offering prayers and encouragement without any expectations or hidden agendas. These people had earned the right to be called family through their consistent actions and genuine concern for my well-being. I started thinking about all the ways that real families operate versus how toxic families function, and the differences were staggering. Real family members show up consistently through both good times and bad times. They celebrate your successes without jealousy or demands for their own benefit, and they offer support without keeping score of what you owe them in return. Toxic families, on the other hand, disappear when you need them most and reappear when you have something they want. They turn your blessings into their opportunities, and they use guilt, manipulation, and threats to control your behavior. Family isn't just about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up consistently, who prioritizes your growth and happiness, and who demonstrates love through their actions rather than their words. The most profound realization came when I understood that I had been surrounded by my real family for years, but I'd been so focused on trying to fix my relationship with Patricia and David that I'd been taking these genuine relationships for granted. Uncle Robert, Pastor Williams, Mrs. Henderson, my coworkers who had celebrated my inheritance without asking for handouts, my neighbors who had offered to help me deal with my parents' invasion of my apartment. These were the people who had chosen to love me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They had proven their loyalty through years of small kindnesses, consistent support, and genuine care for my well-being and my future. Family isn't about who raised you or who shares your DNA. It's about who chooses to show up for you day after day, year after year, without expecting anything in return except the privilege of being part of your life. But understanding this truth about real versus fake family was about to help me make some final decisions about boundaries, forgiveness, and what it means to protect the relationships that actually matter, while cutting ties with the people who only see you as a means to an end. As I sit here today, 6 months after the dust settled from the most intense family drama of my life, I can finally see God's hand orchestrating every detail to teach me lessons about identity, worth, and what it means to find true peace when the people who should love you most turn out to be your biggest source of toxicity. The legal battle that Patricia and David had threatened never materialized because their lawyer took one look at Uncle Robert's ironclad will and the detailed documentation he'd left explaining his decisions, and basically told them they didn't have a leg to stand on. Turns out Uncle Robert had been way ahead of their game. He'd included a letter specifically addressing why he'd chosen not to leave anything to his brother or his brother's wife, citing years of financial irresponsibility, manipulation, and their treatment of me as his primary concerns. Reading Uncle Robert's final letter to me was both heartbreaking and healing, because it proved that he'd been watching the dysfunction in my family for years and had been quietly planning to break the cycle of toxicity that had defined the Patterson family for generations. He wrote about seeing my potential when I was just a kid, about watching me survive Patricia and David's neglect and emotional abuse, and about his decision to invest in my future because he believed I had the character and integrity to honor his legacy. The most powerful part was when he wrote, "Stella, real love doesn't demand or manipulate. It gives freely and trusts the recipient to make wise choices. The fact that you've remained kind and generous despite everything you've endured tells me that God has big plans for your life. Instead of letting this inheritance isolate me or make me suspicious of everyone's motives, I chose to use it as a tool for honoring Uncle Robert's values and blessing the people who had shown me what real family looked like. I established a scholarship fund at our church for young women aging out of foster care because I understood what it felt like to need family and support during difficult transitions. I also expanded Uncle Robert's construction business into a nonprofit that provides home repairs for elderly and disabled community members who can't afford contractors, because he had always believed that your skills and resources should be used to serve others, not just yourself. The greatest victory wasn't keeping the money away from Patricia and David. It was discovering that my peace and my identity didn't depend on their approval. their presence in my life, or their ability to finally become the parents I'd always wanted them to be. True peace comes from knowing that God sees your heart, understands your struggles, and approves of your choices when they align with His character and purposes for your life. I learned that leaving justice in God's hands doesn't mean being passive or allowing people to mistreat you. It means protecting yourself wisely while trusting that God will ultimately make all things right in His perfect timing. The inheritance that Uncle Robert left me wasn't just financial security. It was the foundation for a life built on faith, integrity, and the kind of love that doesn't come with strings attached or hidden agendas. When I stopped trying to earn love from people who weren't capable of giving it freely, God was able to show me the abundance of genuine love that had been surrounding me all along. The true peace doesn't come from having toxic family members finally treat you right. It comes from finally having the wisdom and the courage to stop expecting them to be something they're not, and instead embracing the family that God has actually placed in your life. But this story isn't quite over yet, because Patricia and David had one more card to play that would backfire so spectacularly it would become the perfect ending to this whole saga. As we reach the end of this wild journey together, I want you to take a moment and really think about the people in your own life who you call family, because this story isn't just about me dealing with manipulative parents. It's about recognizing the difference between people who genuinely love you and people who only love what you can do for them. If this story has opened your eyes about toxic family dynamics, made you think differently about boundaries and forgiveness, or helped you realize that you deserve better than conditional love, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up so other people can find this message when they're struggling with their own family drama. I know there are people watching right now who are dealing with parents, siblings, or relatives who only show up when they need something. And I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not crazy for feeling frustrated by their behavior. Have you ever had family members treat you like a bank account instead of a human being? Drop a comment below and share your story. Sometimes knowing that other people have survived similar situations is exactly what someone needs to hear. The most important thing I learned through this nightmare is that you can't buy genuine love, and you shouldn't have to pay emotional or financial ransom for people to treat you with basic respect and decency. Real family celebrates your successes without trying to take credit or profit from them, supports you through difficult times without keeping a scorecard of what you owe them, and loves you consistently whether you're broke or wealthy, struggling or thriving. If the people in your life only contact you when they need something, disappear when you're going through hard times, or use guilt and manipulation to control your behavior, then you have my permission to create whatever boundaries you need to protect your peace and your future, even if those boundaries include cutting them off completely. I need you to understand that setting boundaries with toxic family members doesn't make you a bad person, and choosing your mental health over their comfort doesn't make you selfish or unforgiving. You can pray for someone's healing and transformation while still protecting yourself from their destructive behavior. And you can love people from a distance when loving them up close becomes toxic to your own well-being. God doesn't call us to be doormats in the name of grace. He calls us to be wise about who we trust with our hearts, our resources, and our future. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved is to stop enabling destructive patterns by refusing to participate in the dysfunction. If you're in a situation where family members are pressuring you with guilt, obligation, or financial demands, I want you to know that your worth isn't determined by your ability to solve other people's problems or meet their expectations. Your identity comes from being a beloved child of God, not from your ability to keep toxic people happy, and you have the right to choose peace over people-pleasing, wisdom over wishful thinking, and healthy relationships over familiar but harmful ones. The people who truly love you will respect your boundaries and support your decisions, even when those decisions don't benefit them personally. After hearing my story about inheritance, manipulation, and discovering what real family actually looks like, I want to know what you think. Would you have handled Patricia and David's threats differently than I did? Do you believe that being related by blood automatically makes someone family? Or do you think family is something that has to be earned through love, loyalty, and consistent actions? Have you ever had to choose between keeping toxic relatives happy and protecting your own sanity? What's your take on forgiveness when it comes to people who continue to hurt you even after you've given them multiple chances to change? If you want more stories about surviving family dysfunction, setting healthy boundaries, and finding your worth in something bigger than other people's approval, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. And stay tuned for my next story, where I'll reveal what happened when Patricia and David made one final desperate attempt to get my money that backfired so badly it actually made me feel sorry for them. You definitely don't want to miss that epic conclusion.